Hey everyone, you are in the right place. This is the FIJ webinar Inside the Investigation. I'm Ellen Weiss. We've got about 24 people, and we hope for more, but we can get started. Just want to tell you a little bit about why we started this series. For us at FIJ, we get to shine a light on some really amazing and impactful investigative work and to actually hear from the reporters who did that work, how they did it. We get to hear their tips and get a little insight and suggestions for all of you for how you can take these topics and dig into them in your own community. We obviously get to talk about how FIJ funds this kind of journalism, and in the end, we'll tell you how you can apply for grants. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to talk to our guests for about 20 to 30 minutes. If you have questions, just feel free to add them to the Q&A section. Also, we're recording this webinar, and we'll be posting it with the tip sheet on the FIJ website. So if you don't want to take notes, you don't have to. You will also, if you registered for this webinar, you will get a copy of the recording. So all of that, let me move forward. Today's topic is guardianship, which really boils down to how the well-being and financial futures of adults and children, guardianship and conservatorship, how well is that system doing and taking care of the people, and where are there abuses inside of it? We're really fortunate. We have two newsrooms that are represented today, two major investigative projects that we're going to hear about. And, while these two newsrooms and their two stories differ geographically and even in their focus, what they exposed were really horrendous problems and an enormous lack of oversight in sort of this corner of the judicial system that is really so often overlooked. I'm going to begin by introducing Samantha Hogan. So Samantha is now an investigative reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but she spent a year investigating Maine's probate courts. And her reporting documented really these questionable deaths in the states and how the state cared for individuals that had their savings pocketed by the conservators assigned to protecting their interests. Among the most important findings were 8 incapacitated deaths of adults under public guardianship over a 3-year period of time, and authorities didn't even know how these people died. For her work, I should add that Samantha was honored this year with the Livingston Award for Young Journalists. Many of you know this is an award that honors journalists under the age of 35. She started her investigative reporting as an intern at the Washington Post, where I really appreciate that you made over 200 phone calls about officer-involved shootings that occurred in 2015 and 2016. And that ongoing work earned a Pulitzer Prize for the Fatal Force series. Samantha, you probably can talk endlessly about making 200 phone calls, but I'm going to begin by asking you to please explain to us what is a probate court, because that is something that most of us have never heard of.
Well, thanks, Ellen, so much for inviting me to be here. This was a project that I worked on for over a year with the Maine Monitor, which is a nonprofit newsroom up in Maine. And so the probate courts, though, are very different depending on what state you're in. But I would say that there are some core processes that they do. So guardianship, which is something that all of us here on the screen have looked at. Guardianship is when an incapacitated adult has their legal rights to make decisions about housing, how their money is spent, where they're going to live, who they can socialize with, when that is given by a court to another person and they become a guardian. Conservatorship is also another very common thing that probate courts will manage, which is a very similar arrangement to guardianship, but it's limited just to money. And then another thing that probate courts do is manage estates. So after an individual dies, whether they leave a will or maybe there is no formal written will, probate courts often help divide up assets. And so they are dealing with incredibly vulnerable people, or sometimes people who are no longer able to express their own wishes. In Maine, it is controlled locally by each of the 16 counties. They have our only elected judges, and it can lead to a very disparate system. And I think every journalist should look at how their state structures their probate courts and kind of figure out what they're in charge of. They can take away very fundamental rights that people have. Um, they used to be able to remove someone's ability to vote in Maine, but they can also take away the right to marry. Down here in Georgia, you can lose your driver's license, which might be okay. We've all had those difficult conversations with our grandparents about when it's time to stop driving. But when you're talking about an individual with autism who might be under guardianship, if they're 30 years old and they're seeking employment, but the state says you're not allowed to have a driver's license, that can be really inhibitive of someone living a really productive life. So these are all critical questions that you should be asking of your guardianship system.
Great. Well, I'd love you to just briefly describe sort of your story and also like, how did you get interested in it? Like, was it a tip? Was it something you stumbled upon? Was it another piece of reporting you had done? Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So one story in particular told me that there was a system to be evaluated here, and that was a woman. A man had gone into a hospital for a rather routine surgery, a little bit of a risky surgery, where they were going to clear plaque out of one of his major arteries. And on the admissions paperwork to the hospital, this woman is listed as an acquaintance, as a friend. As a result of the surgery, he ends up having a massive stroke and he loses complete ability to speak and to be understood as a result of that stroke. And as he's staying in the hospital, the woman slowly becomes listed as his fiance on the paperwork. And she takes action to remove the power of attorney from the daughter. When he leaves the hospital, she becomes his guardian. And then over a number of years, everything about this man's estate plan changes. He holds large values of property in Maine. He has considerable assets. And despite having a really comprehensive will that I got to look at, that entire will is changed. And so I was like, wow, how does this happen? What systems are missing in Maine's probate courts to detect this? How are they vetting guardians before they're appointed? How are money and assets being tracked and audited to ensure that they're not being exploited? How does a will get rewritten for an individual who can't communicate their own wishes? And so it just sent me down a rabbit hole of trying to figure out what systems were in place in the probate courts in order to guarantee that people's well-being was being looked after and that they also weren't being financially exploited.
Yeah. One of the things that you did was, as part of your reporting, was you ended up having to send out a survey, which is something I've tried to do before, which is really hard. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you kind of decided that was the best way to collect information. Like where were the gaps in kind of what was available information out there and what you were trying to kind of get from doing a survey?
So, Maine had adopted a uniform probate code, which is something that is happening nationally. The probate laws are becoming much more standardized across the country, but that doesn't mean that it's per se being implemented uniformly in a state, particularly in Maine, where there's a lot of local control. Each of these elected judges were being left to basically their own devices to figure out how to make the probate code work in their court. And they did have like meetings and gatherings of the 16 judges to discuss, but really it was still being left up to that one judge to figure out how it was going to be implemented. And so we decided to send out a survey because the law had very specific requirements about what a guardian needed to be like. You needed to pass a criminal background. You couldn't have a criminal history. You couldn't have filed for bankruptcy if you were going to be a conservator. And there were just other things that we wanted to know, whether they were collecting paperwork. And there was one fundamental question that we couldn't get anywhere, which was just how many adults in Maine were under approved guardianships. And you would think that the court would be able to have that information. And what we found as a result of that survey was that some courts had zero idea how many people they had. They did not have an exact number, and they had only recently started a reporting requirement. So they weren't, they, one of the largest counties actually said to my face, like, we have no way of knowing whether people are alive or dead. And that just kind of blew my mind. So I put together a survey. I think it was like 16 to 18 questions. Most of them were yes, no. And so that we kind of resulted with a data set that we could analyze, and we could say, you know, a third of the counties were doing this, 2/3 weren't doing this. And we just kind of were probing into what the law said was required to be happening, and whether or not the probate court had a system in place in order to check those things.
Got it. I mean, you faced some hurdles in your reporting. Death certificates are confidential in Maine. You then reviewed hundreds of pages of probate court records. Talk about the lucky break that you got as you were going through some of your data.
So one of the most complicated things about reporting in Maine often is that death certificates are confidential. So you don't know the cause of death and you don't know the manner of death. Journalists rely on death certificates all the time. It blows the minds of colleagues that I run into that we couldn't get this basic information in Maine. So what I found out was that public guardianship deaths were being monitored by the medical examiner's office. And a public guardianship is when the state steps in for an incapacitated adult, and they assign a state employee who becomes responsible for managing health decisions, housing decisions, social decisions for an incapacitated adult. And so, knowing that, I went to the medical examiner's office and I said, hey, I want anonymized data because I want to see causes of death. I want to see manners of death. I want to see when people are dying under public guardianship. And they said, absolutely, we will give you that data, but we're withholding a certain number of them because we've got to go to the attorney general's office and see if we can release those. And so the little siren that goes off in journalists' head, I was like, that's the data I want. But let's see how this plays out. And my lucky break was that the attorney general's office actually inadvertently released the names of cases where the deaths were undetermined, and also a woman who was under public guardianship whose death they had determined was a homicide. And this was data that was missing from the medical examiner's office. And am I still here? Okay, I might have just lost power. But equipped with that information, I was able to go into the probate court records, and I was able to find months or sometimes decades of records about how that person's care had been managed. And what we found was very disturbing. The medical examiner records showed that multiple, often mentally disabled individuals had been overprescribed medication, and that had been a factor in their death. And that also, I was routinely finding guardians were providing identical reports year after year, or nearly identical reports year after year, and that probate judges weren't detecting it. And so I did write about these 8 individuals who the state was very uncertain about exactly the manner in which they had died. I confirmed that there was a 2-year investigation by the state police into one profoundly disabled woman who had cerebral palsy and a mental disability, and she had been in state care since she was 2.5 years old. She died, I believe, in her 50s. And so it was a lucky break that we got those names, because we wouldn't have been able to get them through death certificates. But I think it really shined a light on like the dark corners of this system. There's so many people in guardianship that are trying to do the right thing, but it's I think there's a real responsibility of journalists to look for where the systemic failures are and who are the people that are falling through those cracks.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to be back to you, but I want to introduce Joshua Ceballos, I hope I got that right, and Daniel Rivera, who are both part of a team at WLRN, which is the public radio station in Miami. They investigated the guardianship program in Dade County. This is the nonprofit agency that takes on cases where individuals can't afford a private guardian, don't have relatives who can act as a guardian. Their three-part series was called Unguarded. And again, another award-winning Unguarded won the top award for audio investigations from large newsrooms at IRE. So before joining WLRN as a local government and investigations reporter, Joshua worked for the Miami New Times. Again, he really understood Miami city politics, police accountability, and to quote him, the wild stories in the sunniest place for shady people. I love that quote. Daniel Rivera is part of WLRN's new investigation reporting team. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think this story that you did was the investigative team's first story, right? So your
Yep,
first.
it was our first story together. Yep.
Amazing. Daniel was an investigative reporter and producer for The Naked Truth, which was for Fusion, I believe. Um, and I want to first ask you guys to tell us about the origins of your story. Again, was it a tip? It was outgrowth of the work, and describe a little bit because yours was sort of hyper focused on a very particular slice of guardianship and how it played out in your county.
Yeah,
Yeah, Danny, if you want to take how we got it, yeah.
yeah, I'll take that. I mean, part of it's just the nature of living in Miami and South Florida. Like, we don't have a lot of industry here. Like, the main industry here is real estate buying and selling, and speculation and whatnot. So a lot of the reporting that I do, is based on real estate ultimately. So I was working on a story about real estate in the aftermath of the Surfside condo collapse a couple of years ago. And then someone, one of the sources mentioned to me, it's like, you should look into, this thing that's happening with the guardianship program here in Dade County, because there's this company that's, connected to the city attorney for the city of Miami. Like, her husband owns this company. It looks like somehow they're acquiring all these houses. And it looks like they're selling them, and they're selling them quickly. Like, I don't know what's going on there. And it was like, there was a few examples, but I didn't know how widespread this was. So I said, okay, let me do my story on the condo collapse stuff. And then afterwards, Josh joined the team, and then I said, Josh, I think this is something we should look into. So, I got started just with a name and a company name, and I started just looking through like hundreds of guardianship cases in the courts, and trying to pull up dockets, just trying to like figure out. I knew there was a couple dots that connected, but I didn't know if there was more dots. And we started to peel back the layers together, and that's really where it started. A good tip. Ellen, you're muted.
Yeah. What happens when, to the assets of someone who's placed under their care? How does that work?
Right. So I can take that. So the guardianship program of Dade County is a nonprofit that the county and the state of Florida have kind of funded in order to take care of people and be their guardian of last resort if they've got nobody else. It's instead of like a private guardian, like one person, it's a whole nonprofit setup for this. And when someone becomes a ward of the guardianship program, which is court appointed, uh, the program gets control of their assets, and what they're supposed to do ostensibly is to use their assets in order to care for that person. So what we really laser focused on was the instances in which the guardianship program was selling off these people's real property, usually homes, apartments, in some cases cars, and different things, um, in order to pay for, medical bills, in order to pay for them staying in a nursing home, or in many cases to pay off the mortgage because these people had outstanding mortgages, and so the guardianship program would sell their homes at a reduced amount just to pay off the mortgage or what have you. But that's where we kind of saw that there was a lot of opportunity for abuses, like where Danny was saying the same company that was politically connected to the city attorney of the city of Miami was buying these houses over and over and over again. and many times for below market value, and flipping them a week later, a day later, a month later for
Same
tens
day.
of thousands of dollars more. Same day in some cases, flipping it for tens of thousands of dollars more, hundreds of thousands of dollars more.
Right. So taking someone's home, selling it for $75,000 for the homeowner, turning it around, selling it for $300,000, therefore really reducing both the resources, right, that they're supposed to be providing, for the future needs. Is there any oversight of these home sales? Who's like watching out?
Um, to what Samantha was talking about earlier, the only oversight that really exists is through the courts, and and so we looked at a lot of court records and the court filings, because in order, at least in Florida, I don't know how it is in other places, but before you sell real property of someone under guardianship, you have to get court approval, like explicit court approval. So they have to make filings to the court, and then the judge has to come back and then say, okay, do it. And so there was quite a bit of paper trail in that, and we focused on that. A lot of times the sales were approved same day, next day. I mean, it doesn't appear like there was a lot of scrutiny
Yeah,
into how
it
some of
looked like a rubber stamp for sure.
Yeah. You sent me a little bit of tape, and maybe you could talk about some of those victims in your story. I'm going to share my screen. Maybe talk us into Sonia Raymond. So
Yeah.
let's see.
So in a lot of, just to kind of set this up, a lot of these cases, it was difficult to find sources to talk about these stories because the individual ward was either dead or too old or incapacitated, and they had no living relatives, which is why they're in the guardianship program at all. But in some cases, we were able to find some living relatives. So you're going to hear from Sonia Raymond, who is the daughter of Juana Raymond. Her mother and Juana Raymond was a ward of the guardianship program, and the guardianship program sold Juana's house without really talking to the children, the living children, who wanted to keep the property. So you're going to hear from Sonia now, the daughter.
Raymond tried to find out how much the house would sell for, but she says no one at the program would tell her. The guardianship program wouldn't answer our questions. The house sold for $36,500.
The only reason I found out how much the house was sold for was because I went into the property appraisers and it finally came up that they sold it for like only 30. So I'm like, oh my God, I could have bought mom's house. That's nothing. That house sold for way under market, way under market.
Raymond says when the house was sold, everything went with it. A court filing notes personal items disposed of as per court order.
When I tell you we got nothing, we got nothing. Nothing from the inside of the house. Even all the pictures of my children, of my sisters. I mean, my mom had 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You're talking about 10 grandchildren that lived, that knew that as abuela and abuelo's home. It's just incredible.
A month after the company Gallego Homes bought the Raymond's house from the guardianship program, it turned around and resold it for $60,000.
And just to reiterate, I mean, this was a case that happened many years ago. We found that similar things were happening very recently. But they sold it almost double what they bought it for within a month. And that's quite a remarkable profit margin.
Yeah.
Which raises real serious questions about, the whole point of selling a house is to make money for the ward, the person under their care. And if you're able to flip it for double the amount, were you actually doing this in their best interest? And yeah.
Yeah. You guys also had some challenges getting records because Florida's probate court records aren't online. So what did that mean for your newsroom? Like, how did you go about getting the data?
Yeah, so I'll let Danny talk about getting like the big pot of data, but I'll start by saying it was cool for me joining this investigative team, and the first project we did was this, because I got to go with Danny down to the courthouse and go to the probate court office, which was my first experience doing that, and that was pretty neat. And the people who worked there, the clerks, were confused. They're like, "Why do you want these records? Who are you? How are you related to this?" And we have to redact this, don't you know? And we're like, "Yes, we're reporters. We know you have to redact these records. We know we have to pay for them, blah, blah, blah." And that was actually a big part why FIJ was a super big help. We applied for a Fund for Investigative Journalism grant, and we received the grant, and that helped us pay for a lot of the records, because I think it was $1 per page, and we were doing hundreds of pages of probate records for this story. It started out with us, we didn't know what we were looking for, so we just asked for all of the documents, or all of these different documents from this person's case. And then we kind of were able to narrow it down from there and see, oh, we only really need to see the document that shows when the guardianship program asked the court for permission to sell this person's house. And then we were able to go from there and just request those and get, again, hundreds of pages. But Danny could talk about like the really big data set we got.
Yeah, I mean, it was $1 a page, which we did feel was pretty darn high. And we actually talked to some attorneys, and there was some dispute about like whether we should be able to just review the records, or if they would have to give us a copy. The clerk of courts said they had to give us a copy, and it had to be redacted, and the price was $1. And so we did. I mean, we just requested way too many records at first, but we just didn't know what we needed until we got it, and then we were able to narrow it down. And the separate part is with the state of Florida. This is all technically overseen by the Department of Elderly Affairs, which I don't know if all states have it, but Florida has a big elderly population, so we have a Department of Elderly Affairs. And I requested a bunch of records relating to complaints and whatnot from that department, which costs just in itself almost $1,000. So it was not cheap to do that, and we were only able to make those requests thanks to the grant that FIJ got us.
Wow.
And we also used the grant. I will add to we're a radio station, and we were able to hire an engineer to actually like mix the recordings that we had to make this like really pop on the air. So it wasn't just a report that you hear that just like goes by. We really were able to polish it into something that was sonically standing out, and that really did justice to all the reporting that we did. And I think that actually played a big impact in the way that it was received by the public. I mean, we aired it in the morning, and by that afternoon, they were talking about it in the county commission and calling for an investigation. Like, it was immediate.
Wow.
Because people heard it on their drive time, and then they felt like they had to respond to it.
Yeah. Wow. I want to go to one other cut of tape, and one of the things you did was you found 14 home sales between the guardianship program and a private company called Express Homes. And maybe you can just talk a little bit about what struck you about some of those transactions.
Right.
So I can do that and lead us into the Emma Ladson tape. And Danny, if I miss anything, please. But what struck us was really, first of all, like how repeated it was that this same company was getting properties from the guardianship program so many times over the years. And we were able to discover, as we got more and more records, we were able to discover more and more transactions. And it wasn't even just Express Homes. We were able to kind of create this web where we found out it was Express Homes, which was run by the husband of the city attorney. And then there was Gallego Homes, which was on paper run by the mother of the city attorney of the city of Miami. And then there were all these other satellite companies that were all friends and had very clear connections with the city attorney's family. So that stuck out to us immediately. But beyond that, it was just the fact that, like the Raymond house, they would sell a property for $30,000. And then a month later, they would sell it for $60,000, doubling the profits. And in some cases, the Express Homes and their attorney would argue, oh, these houses were in extremely dilapidated condition. That's why they sold for so little. And this guy's a home flipper, like he's good at doing repairs. That's why he was able to sell it for so much. But in some cases, the sales happened the same day or the next day or a week later. There's no way that there was repairs done to that level. And the reason that, like you pointed out, Ellen, that money is supposed to go when the guardianship sells a property, it's supposed to go towards the incapacitated ward. But if they're not getting the most bang for their buck, that money's not going to this person is in need. And so when it comes to Emma Ladson, who we're going to hear from now, she lived in the home with her mother, who became a ward of the guardianship program through some family drama. And like that's another thing, like Samantha talked about during her panel at IRE. You can't really get into all like the family stuff because it kind of distracts from the broader story. But Emma Ladson's mom was in guardianship. That she lived in this house, and then the guardianship program sold the house while she was still living in it and evicted her and her daughter, and just basically put them out on the street, and they had to stay in a homeless shelter after the guardianship program stole their home. So this is Emma Ladson. It should play now. Guardianship program of Dade County sold Rebecca Ladson's Liberty City house to Gallego Homes in 2015. The nonprofit argued it needed to use that money to take care of her.
That was my home. My daughter played in the yard in the neighborhood.
Rebecca's daughter, Emma.
But that was the Latson family home. That's where everybody came. So all the Latsons were like, what did you do? Why did you sell that home for this low amount? I said, I never sold anything. I'm shocked. I was appalled. I couldn't believe it. And when I looked it up, 30 something $1,000?
31.
Are you kidding me? I just couldn't believe it.
Gallego Homes turned around and resold that property the following month to a business associate for $1,000 less than they bought it for. That business partner still owns and rents the property to this day.
And I'll just jump in on the back end of that. Like when we started reporting this, we didn't realize it was going to be a series. It's like we did the first story, and then we found out, oh, there was this other company that's also been doing this, which is owned by the mother of the city attorney. The first story we did was about her husband's company. And we realized actually the city attorney lived in a house that they bought through the guardianship program in a ward's home. This house was bought by the company owned by the city attorney's mother and sold to a business associate who still owns the home. And then the part 3 of the series, we actually put it all together. The guy that bought the home that still owns it now was actually the appraiser who appraised the property that was sent to the courts in order to sell this for a low amount, which then he bought for even lower. So it's like as the series went on, we were able to say, this is not just a fluke. Like there are clearly connections between these people, and this is a network that has been profiting off of this through the guardianship program. And that was, the most shocking part. I mean, honestly, shocking for us as reporters too. We're like, how can this be? How can this be?
Well, I'm gonna ask you one more question, but I want to encourage the audience to put your own questions in there, because you actually interwove Miami politics in a big way, all the way up to the mayor's office. And I just wonder, like, did you know that going in, or did you just have that like holy cow moment as you were connecting those dots?
So I think don't quote me on this, but in Miami, corruption is a matter of course in politics. And so you're right. And like that's just the expectation. That's your bottom line, is when you're seeing something like, okay, where's the corruption at? But we didn't know that this went all the way up to Francis Suarez when we went in. We knew it had to do with Victoria Mendez, obviously, because her husband owned this company and he was going before city boards trying to like take liens off of these properties, and those boards are staffed by her employees. So that was the very clear, obvious line of corruption that we saw. But then we found that Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, who, when he's not being the mayor, he is an attorney and for multiple law firms, multiple real estate and development law firms and land use. So he signed off on several of the deeds and the transactions that were involved in these guardianship cases. and he's the one that actually pushed to put Victoria Mendez as the city attorney. So that was kind of a big moment for us, seeing that his name pop up on 3 or 4 different properties. And we also saw that another attorney who signed off on these transactions, Sergio Mendez, no relation to Victoria Mendez, he signed off on several of these, so he was paid for these transactions. He's actually, or was, a guardianship program board member. So he's a board member of the guardianship program, selling these properties, and he's making money off of those transactions as the title agent. So
Wow.
he's deeply entrenched in the community. He was like part of the Cuban American Bar Association or something like that.
Yeah.
So we didn't go into it thinking it went all the way to the top, but we kind of felt like that meme with like the board and all of the like red lines on the wall.
We had that board.
We
You had
had
that
the board. We made a giant board with
and like,
post-it notes.
I think we can go on and on, but like, we didn't know all this going in, and then actually just a month or two ago, the county inspector general's office released a report on all this stuff that underscored everything that we're saying. Like, these are all complicated, tangled, you know, connections that violate all kinds of conflicts of interest, and you know, are violating state law and whatnot. And we were very happy to see that report, but it went well beyond the scope of what we were doing.
Yeah.
But we definitely called attention to the whole thing.
Well, we have one question for Danny and Joshua. This is from Bill Marimo. Did you ever interview the guardians who flipped the houses? And if so, how did they explain or rationalize their actions?
I guess you could talk about Carlos McDonald, Danny, right?
Yeah, I mean, I did, you know, the heads of the companies generally didn't want to talk to us. They talked to us through their attorney a couple times, and you know, they pushed against us, but they weren't really able to say anything that we did was inaccurate. I did talk, like, for the first story to the director, the executive director of this guardianship program. And he was very defiant, to be honest. Like, he said he hasn't done anything wrong. He still maintains that he's done nothing wrong, even after the county inspector general report. Now some commissioners are trying to get him off the board, and it's very complicated. But then he just stopped answering our phone calls. So, like, the second and the third parts of it is just no response, none whatsoever. They did not want to talk about it. And unfortunately, I don't know, we would have liked to talk more, but we had to
Yeah, I would.
report what we could with the records.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's like we for me, if I could do it again, I would have pushed a little harder to get these people to talk to us, because we wanted, we wanted them to explain themselves. And in a lot of cases, we had to do a little bit of magic with audio, where we couldn't get him, Carlos McDonald on tape for our recording. So we found old county commission meetings that were recorded where he spoke and talked about getting money from the county. So we used that tape in the story. But yeah, this was a really records heavy investigations, because that's a lot of what we had was just records.
Yeah. Samantha, I want to come back to you for a sec, because when you got that a lucky break, right, from the that the Attorney General's office mistakenly included it, the Attorney General then asked you not to publish that, and asked the Maine Monitor, right, not to publish the names of the people whose deaths had been labeled. Well, there was the one homicide and then the undetermined. And I wonder what the conversation was in your newsroom to decide, no, we are going to publish it. Like, was that a hard one? Did you go back and forth, or were you like, no, we're going to publish this?
So you always have to have really careful conversations in small newsrooms about how you're going to handle the Attorney General's office telling you that that information is confidential. We would really like you to not publish it. We shouldn't have released it to you. So like I said, the Maine Monitor is a nonprofit. There was 5 reporters while I was there, and an executive director and an editor. So it was, it's great, direct line to the top, to have that difficult conversation. We did consult lawyers that believed in the mission of the Maine Monitor about how we legally stood. And we felt really confident that we were on solid footing to publish those names despite it being confidential in state law. And I'm really glad that we did, because I think it really brought public attention to a state system that does not get a lot of attention and has historically not gotten a lot of attention in Maine. And it's good, it's easy, quote unquote, to talk about guardianship in the abstract. But I think what this series did, and what I got compliments for afterwards, was actually telling real people's stories and putting their names to it. And that makes it very real for people. And how I'm still disturbed by how some of those people died. And I still don't feel like we got all of the answers to the circumstances that led to those deaths and how those circumstances could be prevented again in the future. And so I think it was really important that we published those names, and we were pretty steadfast in that decision, but we obviously consulted some lawyers, and I encourage anyone to do that before just publishing.
Yes, probably a good idea. Both your newsrooms, your stories had some pretty significant impact. And Samantha, I'll start with you. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what happened as a result of your reporting.
So after we published the death story, there was a call immediately for there to be a state legislative hearing on this. They called in the medical examiner's office. They called in the Department of Health and Human Services that was running the public guardianship system. They called in one of the probate judges. They called in advocates for individuals with disabilities. So Maine Disability Rights was called in, and they really put everyone in one place, and they had for over 3 hours asked questions about what needed to change to the guardianship system. They ultimately decided that they weren't going to do a deeper dive into the 8 deaths, but there was proposed legislation to add an inspector general who would have the right to look at these confidential files. There was also a proposal that the Government Oversight Committee do an investigation of the deaths. And then the Department of Health and Human Services is very large in Maine, and there were several proposals for a number of years to break apart that department so that there was more direct lines to the top, so that when there were issues, they could investigate them better. And so it definitely got a really good conversation going. On top of that, there used to be an Office of Advocacy in Maine, which was specific to look at complaints of people with disabilities who are receiving services from the state, as well as do death investigations. Institutionalization of individuals with disabilities is not that long ago. Maine only closed their last facility in the 90s. And that was a result of the consent decree. I think we all need to remember that there are still people living that were institutionalized as children because of disabilities and other different ailments. And so the way that we treat that is very different. I happen to know that Maine just got a letter from the Department of Justice about how it's handling individuals with disabilities in its community and whether it's adequately meeting those services. I think that's another avenue of the probate courts that we all need to pay really close attention to, because often one of the elements of this series that we didn't get a chance to talk about was that at age 18, people that have IEPs or have been in special education programs their parents are often very encouraged to go to the probate court and to get guardianship of them, to continue making decisions and to be involved in their medical decision making. But in Maine, those people are not guaranteed a lawyer at their hearings. And I interviewed several people who were not given a lawyer and were not even physically present when their parents were awarded guardianship of themselves. This makes complete sense in some situations, but then in others, it may not. Particularly individuals with autism, which we all know is a very large spectrum. And the Uniform Probate Code and certain laws in certain states say that people should aim for a less restrictive alternative to guardianship. And so another really interesting outcome of this investigation was I had several probate judges reach out to me and tell me that they were now looking more critically at less restrictive alternatives to guardianship and what their requirements were under the law, so that people were not needlessly being placed into long-term guardianships.
Yeah, that's amazing that the probate judges are reaching out to you. That's amazing. Daniel and Josh, I want to hear about impact, but just a quick question from someone about whether or not you know about Dr. Sam Sugar and his book Guardianship and the Elderly, The Perfect Crime, and did you speak to that author as part of your reporting? Do you know?
No, we didn't.
Okay, well, good resource for anybody who wants to pursue the angle. But talk a little bit about the impact. You said it by the afternoon or by the evening, you were already seeing impact of your reporting, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, that was pretty incredible when we first published the story to have the county commissioners immediately say like, did you hear the news about this? We need to look into this. And so one of the county commissioners called for an investigation, and the mayor then followed suit. So that took more than a year. I think it took more than a year for that for the Office of the Inspector General to actually come out with their report. And I was constantly bugging them, calling them. I showed up at their office. I was at house parties where I met people who worked there, and they're like, "We can't tell you anything." But finally, they came out with their report, and it the first thing that it did is it validated our reporting, and basically, without naming us, said like what we were reporting was completely correct. Furthermore, it went beyond that and found criminal activity on the part of employees of the guardianship program of Dade County, finding that they were violating state conflict of interest laws. So, two property management people who worked for the guardianship program were doing the same kind of wheeling and dealing where they were using other entities to buy homes for themselves or for their girlfriends and selling these properties and profiting off of it. Um, and so that was a clear conflict of interest. What we found about Sergio Mendez making money on both sides of a transaction, that they found that to be a conflict of interest. And they basically said that the whole program had this kind of breakdown in its barriers when it came to real estate sales, and was violating its own policies when it came to these kinds of things, and it needed further oversight. And Danny can talk about the funding side of things from the county.
Yeah, and just on the immediate impact part, the day the first story came out, the county mayor, and we have a weird system of government here, but there's a city mayor and then there's a county mayor, and the county is like on top of the city. But the county mayor did come out the day of the reporting and said, okay, we pay this guardianship program, like we're cutting off funding immediately. We're gonna just cut them out of the funding because until we investigate this. And then they kind of went back and said, okay, well, the state is making us pay this money by statute, so we can't cut off the funding, but we're gonna make it that they can't sell any houses until we're done with this investigation. So ever since our first report came out, they haven't been able to sell any further properties, and that's still the case. Because it was determined that there needed to be clarity on the whole situation, and the clarity that came out with this report was, is written when they're selling houses, it's supposed to go through any number of realtors or real estate agents, and the data that came out in the report is they were only using a few of them, and they were basically people that were close to some of the parties that we identified. They were also only using very few of the property appraisers. So it was a very tightly knit thing. And, we're still kind of waiting to see what the ultimate result of this will be. There was a bill filed in the Florida legislature last year by a Republican here in Miami. Didn't go anywhere. There is a lot of institutional pushback from the bar association, from judges that like the system more or less how it is, on doing some reforms. But there are some reforms that have been done. similar to what Samantha was saying at the beginning, that there is no transparency about like who's in guardianship, how many cases there are, where they are. Um, there is a new requirement that just went into effect very recently that should start to provide a little bit of transparency about where guardianship cases actually are, so that any future reporters or attorneys looking into this can actually have some idea of where these kind of cases exist. Because
Yeah.
everyone was flying blind before.
Wow. I wonder if we could do kind of a quick round the horn, and this question for all of you, which is like, what do you wish you knew at the beginning of the reporting that you kind of had to learn the hard way, but like, man, I wish I knew that going into this. Samantha, I'll start with you.
Just the volume of confidential records that exist surrounding this topic. I never got Adult Protective Services to speak to me, despite me asking. Just going to them with different avenues into it. They never agreed, and so I knew that they were getting complaints about concerns about abuse or neglect or fraud. We weren't able to get that. And so I don't think it should be a deterrent, but it definitely, like, there was a depth of reporting that I desired to do, that just simply because of how confidential certain documents were within the Department of Health and Human Services, there were just questions we couldn't answer. And then I was rushing against a clock because the legislature was intending to actually make all of the probate court records confidential the following year. And so that deadline ended up getting pushed back, but there was like a moment where everything just went offline. And that was really scary. And I realized I couldn't do that. So kind of knowing how to access the records and how to find the people is really important work to do up front.
Great. Daniel or Josh, whichever one of you want to go first.
Yeah, quickly. I mean, hearing Samantha, it does make me grateful that Florida, despite a lot of issues just in general with state agencies, like most state agencies won't talk to reporters, period. I don't know what their PIOs do, but they do not talk to reporters. And it's a legitimate, very big problem. But we do have very robust public records laws, and some of the best public records laws in the country in Florida, and that's great. I mean, it's even if you have to pay a page to, I'm sorry, $1 per page to look at it, you can look at it, and that's very good. But what we don't always know going in, and I think it's part of the always evolving process of investigative reporting, is just learning like what data is out there, like what are the possible public records that you can get. And at some point I realized like the county property appraiser's office has a master spreadsheet of all property transactions that have happened since the 1990s, since like 94, I think. And man, boy, do I wish I knew that when we started doing this reporting. because like if you search it now, you can only see who owns properties right now. But when we actually got the full data set, we were able to see what properties did a company used to own that they sold, when did they sell it, and then we can go and look at the history of those properties. I really wish I knew that on the front end. That would have saved us a lot of time. And I don't know how many other places have it, but that's one thing I wish I knew.
Yeah.
I think just from a process perspective, I've learned to be a lot more, not, I wouldn't say I'm organized, but a lot more organized than I was when I started this job. I think something that didn't kind of occur to us until like the second or third story, was to, from the beginning, start a comprehensive timeline and also create a spreadsheet of every single house, who owns it, who bought it, how much it was bought for, we had like a lot of disparate documents. Like one was a Google Doc, and we had one small spreadsheet, and then we had a bunch of Post-it notes, and we had some notebooks, and all these different places. That finally at the end, and it was a little bit frustrating, but for the last story, we did make a master spreadsheet. Like these are all the guardianship properties that we know of that were sold to these companies. This is who it was sold to, da 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 da. And we made a timeline of all the sales starting from like 2010 or whatever, or 2008, just going through and putting it in chronological order. So after that, I've started doing that for all my stories and investigations. From the jump, I make a timeline and I make a spreadsheet, and that makes my life so much easier. So just from a process perspective for any kind of investigation, I would say always start that from the beginning, because you're going to save yourself a headache down the line.
Oh, that's great advice. And there's a lot more advice from these remarkable reporters. If you want to cover this topic, there's a tip sheet. I'm going to share my screen one more time as we say goodbye, because there's a couple of, whoops, let's see if that's going to work. Yeah. So the tip sheet can be found on the FIJ website. Just for anybody who wants to apply for a grant, FIJ has 2 grants. They're the regular grants, which are up to $10,000. And we're about to start a new round, so you have lots of time to plan, January 27th. We also have seed grants, which really is that early reporting that you need to do that often isn't supported to like figure out if you have a story. Those grants are up to $2,500. So maybe you can get a little data. Maybe you can do a little bit of travel if you need to try and talk to a source. That deadline is January 31st. You can find details about all of this on our website. We also have like webinars to help you if you've never applied for a grant or you want some tips about applying for the grant. So I just want to thank Joshua, Daniel, Samantha for your time, for your tips, for your reporting. This was so valuable, so important. And I want to encourage people out there. This is happening in your communities. This is happening in your state. This isn't just Miami or Maine. And it's ripe for digging into. So thank you all. Thanks for spending the last hour with us talking about this topic, and have a great weekend. Take care.
Thank you. And thank you to FIJ for the grant and the opportunity.
Our
Yeah,
pleasure.
thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.